20 Traveling to New Zealand. Kim, Jin Mi. I, Jiang Mi Jin, was born in the 20th century and celebrated my millennium at the age of 30. At that time, the first New Year's event in 2000 was popular. At the end of the year, for example, in Dokdo in South Korea's east or foreign countries like Fiji went to the millennium, it is the wish of many people who have taken to the end of 1999. Fiji didn't want to spend a fortune, so the choice was New Zealand. I was worried that a woman would travel to a faraway country alone, so I lured my youngest sister without a job. At that time, my sister didn't have any money to go on a trip, but she went with me because I said I would pay for it. However, my conscientious sister wrote me an IOU to pay me back someday. I didn't mean to receive it, but I did. I planned a trip to New Zealand expecting about 33 days. My parents seemed surprised, too. It is amazing that a child who has only read books at home goes on a trip, but parents also wondered why children were going on a backpacking trip for more than a month without a guide on an overseas trip, not a domestic trip. Still, they worried that I'm going with my younger sister, but they also wondered why I was going on a backpacking trip for more than a month without a guide on an overseas trip, not a domestic trip. Still, they are worried that I'm going with my younger sister, but my parents gave me permission. From a month before the trip, I organized travel routes, researched places to go, places to eat, places to sleep, transportation, etc. and prepared round-trip tickets and international student ID cards. My sister trusted me without thinking and just followed me, so I had to prepare everything. And the married sister couldn't go with me, so I gave her a set of bedclothes and said I'd go with the youngest, and we both boarded a flight to New Zealand. We used the plane Air New Zealand. It would be nice to use a Korean Air, but the price was so different that the travel agency said Air New Zealand was the most suitable flight. Both of our sisters wore training suits, and among other travelers at the airport, a Korean asked us if we were college students going to New Zealand to play golf. I was so surprised that I asked back if everyone in training clothes was a sports athlete. We wore training clothes throughout the trip and people called us training sisters. There's an episode about this outfit that a British tourist called me lady on a trip. Most of them called me a girl, but when I asked why they called me a lady, they said it was because my clothes, or this tracksuit I was wearing, with the big letters Hardy Amy's London. When asked why this brand was wearing it, he said it was a royal brand and it was worn by royalty and nobles. I didn't know that at all, and I was glad it looked good anyway. New Zealand is a country of 2 islands. Since we entered in the South Island and planned out a route from the North Island, we set the destination from Christchurch, the South Island, to Auckland, the North Island. There is no pass like a trip to Europe because train routes weren't very advanced. We almost used the bus. As we are about to arrive, I looked down the window of the plane and saw all the green and white spots. It was a flock of sheep in the grass. Oh! We're in New Zealand. A country with more sheep, more cows than people. We left on December 23, 1999 to take the Millennium 4 hours earlier than in Korea. During the trip, I was excited to welcome the new year of 2000. As Christchurch Airport approached, we prepared to take out our backpacks. But most of the passengers said Auckland was their final destination. My sister and I were coming down, and suddenly a flight attendant came out and looked for a Japanese old man. It was an old man who looked at least 80, and he got off thinking that Auckland was the final destination and Christchurch was the destination. I thought the flight attendant was too kind. It was purely that old man's fault, and I was amazed how she found out and admired the professionalism of the Air New Zealand stewardess who got off at Christchurch Airport to find the old man to the end and put him back on the plane. I hope so for our airlines. What was more surprising was that all the flight attendants, as burly ladies, wore makeup-free faces, pants, and comfortable shoes. I was much compared to Korean flight attendants, such as Korean flight attendants, who consisted of tight skirt uniforms, pointed, high-heeled shoes, dark makeup, and unmarried women with skinny model-class bodies. I had much more faith in this burly, comfortable old lady crew. She's actually good at her job. In the situation of emergency, who would be more advantageous to passenger rescue? Anyway, we left the stupid Japanese old man behind and came out of the Christchurch airport. At the end of the year, New Zealand was in the opposite season from ours, so the summer sun was blazing. On the day we arrived, it was so sunny and ultraviolet that we wore sunglasses and sunscreen. But that was the only sunny day. Since then, it has been gloomy, cloudy, and cold, and I usually get cold easily, but I only brought thin clothes, so I wore several layers. It was very different from summer in my country. It was the weather when people like me should just wear a winter parka. It was the summer of the South Island of New Zealand. Christchurch was such a beautiful, clean, well-organized city. Unlike Australia, New Zealand may be a city created by British aristocrats, not by prisoners, but Christchurch was like a new city in England in the 19th century. Christchurch was also an Anglican church. I went into the service, and the Anglican pastor in charge was younger than I thought, and next to the pastor couple, an old woman, who appeared to be the pastor's mother, was sitting in a white nun costume. The Anglican pastor's mother seemed to wear nun clothes when she became a widow. The organist played great music after worship. In the city centre was Victoria Square, the halo of Queen Victoria in the 19th century. We took a long boat across Christchurch, where a man pushed the oars to the ground, and enjoyed the riverside. It was more like a stream than a river. Then I boarded a city bus that ran free of charge in the city, which kept circling the same section. So during my stay in downtown Christchurch, I used this bus to shop at the supermarket. The supermarket opens from 10 a.m., 11 a.m. and closes from 4 p.m., 5 p.m. In this area, all shops close at 4 or 5 o'clock and go home, so there are no people on the road when the sun sets. The lights are on 24 hours a day, and the facilities open 24 hours a day are only in Korea. Accommodation used backpackers exclusively for travelers. There are many youth hostels in Europe, but this country has only one youth hostel in each region, so it has not cut off youth hostelism. After walking for more than 8 hours a day, I went grocery shopping and cooked at the dorm before closing the door. I had no choice but to cook rice even though I was tired to death. Every day, I wake up an hour earlier than my sister, cook rice and soup, wake her up, eat, and go out together. In the evening, I come back to the accommodation and cook again. My younger sister rests in her room. But it was good to meet various tourists from all over the world in the kitchen. One day I was too tired to cook meals, so I was cooking hajang ramen that I brought from Korea. At that time, an Italian young man was making pasta in the next gas stove. An Italian young man asked if I made black pasta as an appetizer. I replied, "No, this is the main dish." Then, the Italian young man was surprised and asked how pasta could be the main dish. He said he would eat pasta with appetizers, beef steak for the main, and fruit for dessert. He also said that no matter how poor travelers are, they have 3 courses of appetizers, main meals, and desserts. My sister and I had hajang ramen for dinner. Then I washed up and slept. Another thing about the kitchen is that all the loudest and dirtiest people in the world were Chinese. They've been cooking all the basic dishes in Chinese, cooking all the gas stoves and kitchen walls spattered with oil, and they've been cooking all the time, and I don't know what they're talking about. Anyway, if Chinese sweep the kitchen once, the kitchen becomes the floor of the market. The hostess also did not welcome the Chinese. In addition to the blanket, they stole electronic equipment such as a hairdryer and checked whether we were Chinese or not when we first entered the accommodation. Some places do not accept Chinese. There was only one Korean restaurant in the city center of Christchurch, but I went there and ate it just once when I really wanted to eat Korean food. Spicy stir-fried spicy pork. Like New Zealanders, this house closed at 4 o'clock and said we had to go home, telling us to wrap it up and go. After that, we bought rice, eggs, potatoes, and onions at the supermarket and cooked rice and soup at the accommodation. I used to cook ramen and eat it instead of soup. Christchurch had a beautiful English garden, a typical English garden. This city is a city of England, so it's a matter of course. In fact, English garden is known worldwide for its style, but I've never heard of Scottish garden. After the tour, I travelled by train to Greymouth, the only train travel course in New Zealand. This course is so beautiful that it's standard to take a train. As expected, the scenery was beautiful. I admired the canyon, the vast terrain. The Greymouth city itself had nothing to see, so next I went to see glaciers. South Island is a glacial island, so it is famous for fjord and glaciers. Among the glaciers, the French Joseph Glacier also went on a guided tour. My sister and a British family of 4 were a team, 1 guide and 6 guests. Naturally, the guide spoke in English and the British family had a natural conversation, but I heard and understood it, but didn't say much. Instead, I was busy interpreting for my younger sister. British children are weaker than we are, so time has been delayed to walk on the glacial course. I guess they only studied at home. Still, the family looked like a noble family. The elegant, the costume, didn't look like a commoner. I went back to sleep as soon as I finished my glacier trekking and had dinner at the accommodation. We headed to the next Cook Mountain. And we hit the Millennium with the energy of Mt. Cook. Millennium in 2000. Ha ha ha. Cook is a mountain 1000 meters higher than Mt. Baekdu, but perhaps because it is high, the top is covered with snow, and the bottom of the mountain was only grass. In other words, the mountain was an ugly mountain with nothing to see. Mountains are beautiful in our country. In my country, mountains' height is reasonable. I feel inclined to go hiking. The mountains and scenery are beautiful, the forests and valleys are beautiful, but we are buried in our hearts as sacred mountains that mark the new millennium. We applied for a trekking course only near the foot of Mount Cook and walked with a New Zealand guide. And during the break, guide made us a traditional British milk tea. I like milk tea by nature. It was cold, but of course it's summer. I liked it because it was warm. I cooked again as soon as I got to the accommodation. In any case, all shops and restaurants in this neighborhood are closed before sunset, so there is no place to buy food even if I want to. I have to cook it. No matter how tired I am. And I have to go grocery shopping in advance. My younger sister ate meal, and did the dishes because she was sorry. Then we slept as if we had fainted in the group accommodation. The next day, we're going on a glacier cruise on Milford Sound. At the accommodation sells tickets for glacier cruise, and 2 types of cheap tickets were large, but there were many people, and expensive tickets were small, but there were few passengers, so it was good to see the fjord. I hesitated for a while and bought an expensive ticket. Fortunately, the next day, the weather was sunny, so the lake shone clear turquoise, the wind was cool, and the fjord glacier was really beautiful. I took a lot of pictures, but nothing came out right photos when I came home. I think it is important to take it with my eyes and save it in my cerebrum, not to risk my life on pictures. How can it not be cold because it is an ice island that feels cold even in summer? Of course it's cold. We shivered and walked hard every day. Glacier trekking and Milford Sound glacier cruise ship tours were completed before heading further east. It was a place called Te Kapo, where the lake was beautiful. The lake was full of purple flowers, where we took pictures with the lake in the background. If it were now, we would have taken a nice picture with our cell phones, but we were a very backward film camera at the time, so we don't have a single picture that came out properly even after using several films. And we took pictures of each other, so there weren't many pictures we took together. There, I saw the Good Shepherd Church, called the world's smallest and most beautiful church. It was just a tourist spot and I wasn't impressed. Then I stopped by Wanaka and went to the city called Queenstown. Well, there wasn't much for my sister to do there. It was a place where young people full of adrenaline from all over the world jumped off the mountain. We looked at them under the mountain and it was some sky. We witnessed a vertical fall due to the flight equipment not being unfolded. It was a terrible moment, but it was a different sky. Everyone continued to jump out of the sky. Just looking at it made me dizzy, so I went to Invercargill, which is close to the southernmost part of New Zealand, and the locals pronounced Invercargill as Invercargill. It seemed to be a Scottish pronunciation. I went to the museum and art gallery here, stayed overnight at the hotel, and went to the city of Dunedin instead of going to Stewart Island. Most people who go to Invercargill are just passing by to go to Stewart Island. Dunedin was a 19th century Scottish-style new town. It was comparable to Christchurch. I met a Korean international student there, and it was nice to meet a Korean in another country after a long time. London and Edinburgh are old cities, but Christchurch and Dunedin are new cities, so they are clean and really seem to be from the 19th century. I stayed here for 3 days and walked all over the city. Then, to the north, we went to Acaro. Acaro was a pretty little French town. It is said that the old French settled down. Certainly, the English, Scottish and French styles all looked very revealing. I think that's the beauty of travelling. New Zealand was not so big that it was fun to visit England, Scotland and France quickly. Now I went to Picton, the gateway to the North Island. We spent 21 out of 33 days in South Island and planned to travel to North Island for 12 days. Calculating the date, there is a pretty beautiful national park called Nelson, and time was running out to see it. So I decided to stay overnight at Picton and go to Wellington, the North Island. In Picton, it was lucky to meet a kind-hearted Anglican pastor and stayed overnight in a free accommodation for homeless vagrants. We cooked rice with the rice we had. There was a 2-tiered pipe organ in the Anglican church, and I played all the notes there as a token of my gratitude to the kind pastor. The Anglican pastor seemed quite surprised, and he thinks I looked like a teenager in the eyes of a black-haired yellow Asian girl. He was interesting to see me play the organ with dexterity. Then he asked if I was an organist. I replied, of course, the main organist. I majored in organ and minor in piano in my undergraduate department. This Anglican pastor was probably the first Asian organist to see. I played the organ at the church and came back to the accommodation, and the 3 of us ate and my sister and I slept soundly on the newly laid sheets. The next morning, I thanked him and went to Wellington by boat from Picton. As soon as I arrived at the North Island, the season changed. The North Island is a volcanic island. I could feel the warmth right away. It was amazing that such a close island is an ice island to the south and an island of fire to the north. And that large amount arrived in Wellington, where none of it was visible. This is the capital of New Zealand. But it's just the administrative capital. I was so disappointed at Wellington, which quickly broke the beautiful natural environment so far, that I set out for the next area. It was a modern metropolis of the 21st century, found everywhere in the world. I didn't go to New Zealand to see such a place. If I'd known this would happen, we would have visited Nelson National Park for a couple of days before coming to the North Island. It went north again to Toonga. This place was pure and simple hell. I regretted traveling abroad for the first time. It was my first trip abroad in my life. I was scared, but I didn't show it to my sister. I'm afraid she's scared, too. Then the sun had already set and I couldn't move. I had no choice but to stay. The accommodation of Toonga is simply a gloomy, messy, and bizarre place that can only be seen in novels, and it seems like a ghost would come out, but the hostess was also like a pub pimp. She looked at me and said, "What are you doing here, little Asian? Are you going to sleep here?" I was like, "I'm 31 years old. And I'm 168 centimeters tall. And I asked if I could use the kitchen because the sun is down and I had to cook rice." Then the pimp lady was surprised. "Kitchen? And cooking?" she asked, raising her eyes. I replied, "Of course I am." Then I went to the kitchen, and a mess was a word used in this place. It's not cleaned, let alone cooking utensils, and it's been almost a month since it's been used it. I sighed. There, I found a pot roughly, washed rice, and cooked rice. A strange-looking small, thin man, who looked gay at a glance. My sister didn't notice anything. The gay-looking man told me that I was a proud girl to cook and came to give me meat. Not only his appearance, but also his voice was thin and coquettish, which seemed to be seeing the Western environment. Then he grabbed the blood-dripping beef with his bare hands and held it out to me. I suddenly had a stomach ache, so I couldn't eat it because I didn't have meat, but I answered vegetarian and politely refused. Then the gay young man looked disappointed and complained to his partner, the burly man. He was real gay. How do I get through this scary night without being caught by my sister? I went to bed thinking about it, but I came out of the hallway because I couldn't sleep all night because it was so noisy. Fortunately, a German traveler like me was protesting against the pimp lady that it was noisy. Then, I asked pimp lady to pay for it, saying that I can't sleep in a place like this. I thought it was an opportunity, so I asked for money to go. Pimp lady said she couldn't give me everything and only gave me half of it, but I also said it was good. I woke my sister up and we followed the German traveler to another accommodation. The young man was more fluent in English than I was, so he figured out a safe and quiet accommodation in the area and went there past midnight. It is a typical New Zealand accommodation, quiet, comfortable and clean. Lady was warm, and I thought we are alive. We woke up late in the morning because we slept late, and other travelers had already eaten breakfast and left. The accommodation was bed and breakfast, B&B, which served breakfast. B&B was never used because it was more expensive than the accommodation where we cooked rice, but we couldn't help it. The German traveler who came with us was also out. The only breakfast left was bread and coffee. Still, we ate breakfast while chewing dry bread, and leave after a deep hug. We took a picture together because I was thankful to owner lady. Finally, we are going to Auckland, the largest city in New Zealand. I came to the North Island and never went as planned, so I couldn't make a reservation. We tried hitchhiking with a picket written Auckland on our sketchbook, we're reckless. We shouldn't have. That was January 2000, and it's just an ignorant act because we're so ignorant and brave. About an hour later, a man pulled over and told me to wait a while. What does it mean? I was wondering and waiting, and another man came in the car and got off, showed me a strange notebook, saying there are many Koreans here. Sigh, it turns out these guys were drug dealers selling cannabis to Asian tourists. I firmly refused to do drugs because it is illegal and I don't smoke naturally. Then, he said, other Korean tourists smoked happily, and kept putting the list of Koreans in his notebook in my eyes. I was so disgusted that I avoided it and stood on the street again with a sketchbook that said Auckland. My sister didn't know anything, so I thought it was a relief. My sister still doesn't know that the beef man who appeared in the Tornga kitchen is gay and that this bearded notebook man is a cannabis dealer. Fortunately, a car driven by a pretty young woman stood in front of us shortly after stopping on the road. Auckland? And I shouted yes. To hear the cannabis man, and we got in the angelic lady's car. It was really an angel who showed up to save us. The cannabis man turned away with a grimace. I can't forget that terrible moment. The angel kindly asked, "Did you sleep in Tornga last night?" And I replied, "Unfortunately, we did, so we leave right away." The angel said it's not a place for tourists to go, and Auckland would be better off. In other words, Tornga was a place equivalent to a trash can in New Zealand, such as heaven. As we reached downtown Auckland, the angel dropped us off and told us to travel well. We said hello to each other and broke up. Arriving at the Auckland accommodation, there were many Koreans and many Korean students who came to study language as New Zealand's largest city. I got information while talking in Korean. We went to a place called Rotorua. The smell of sulfur immediately vibrated and recognized the whole body's senses, namely eyes, nose, mouth, and skin, that it really came to the volcanic island. There really was a volcanic topography park, a symbol of a volcanic island, where I went with 2 British girls. To be exact, one was an English girl and one was a Welsh girl. The 4 Great Britain regions, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, are said to be in a bad relationship with each other, and the 2 girls were travelling in tandem. We went to see the sulphur-smelling park and take a hot spring bath in places like the bubbling lava lake. The girls said that the hot springs here were so dense that they could go in without any objects such as gold and silver. We took off the gold necklace and entered. A really strong sulfur effect was immediately felt on the skin and joints. Arthritis and skin disease patients thought it would be good to recuperate in the Rotorua sulfur hot spring. I've never seen such a strong sulfur hot spring. Even if I wanted to stay longer, the smell of sulfur was so strong that I couldn't stay longer. After a hot spring bath, we said goodbye to British girls and went to an area called Taupo. There was a really pretty emerald lake, and there was a bungee jump. Of course we just watched others jump and we didn't. I asked people who jumped if it was fun, and they told us to try it. But why do we have to pay for such a scary thing? So I just went to see the Fuka Falls right away. I'm disappointed that it's not as big as I thought and it's a small waterfall. Then, we met a Korean pastor couple who moved to Kaikoura and was holding a pioneering church. Pastor Lee and his wife tell us that there is nothing to see on the North Island, and the hot spring is better than the South Island, but they do not recommend staying for another week. After that, the pastor and his wife ask if they will take the Korean children to Kefringa, the northernmost part of the North Island, for a picnic. I had nothing to do and thought it was a good thing, so I immediately agreed. The pastor drove a 15-seater bus, and we participated in the picnic and pay for the round-trip bus fare. It was farther than I thought, but it was comfortable because I spoke Korean. The students said they thought we were Japanese when they saw us talking. When I asked, why? They said Busan dialect sounded like Japanese. I knew for the first time that Busan dialect sounds like Japanese. Anyway, we finally arrived at Kaprainga Street. Unfortunately, the weather was gloomy and the wind blew so hard that no pictures came out. In other words, it is New Zealand's land and village, and there were major city names and Antarctic signs around the world on the signboards. I took a picture there, and when I developed the picture later, it was blurry that only my eyes sparkled like ghosts in the fog. Anyway, we looked north at the end of the land village and were hit by strong waves and winds. But I'm glad we're here. The trip to North Island was completely different from my intention, but I'm glad that the results were good. There were scary situations, but my sister passed without noticing, and I was satisfied. We returned to Auckland from the tip of the land in New Zealand and went around the Auckland shopping centre to buy souvenirs for our family. New Zealand's specialty is wool, as well as deer antlers and placenta creams. I went to see deer antlers, and the first place I went was a store run by a Chinese merchant. The Chinese showed deer antlers and said his house was probably the cheapest in the area. Really? I'll look around somewhere else, I said. There was a Korean New Zealander at the Auckland accommodation, but she said, "What should you do if you go to a Chinese store? You have to go to a Korean store." So I went to a Korean antlers store again. I knew it. Oh, my God! I've had deer antlers since I was young, so I know which one is the best. The merchant offered a higher price selling inferior products, much worse than the ones we saw in the Chinese store yesterday. I immediately realized that both the person who introduced this place and the merchant who sold it were evil merchants who ripped off their compatriots. I only bought placenta cream from New Zealand and went to Auckland Airport to catch a plane even though I didn't buy anything antlers because my mouth was bitter. There was a Korean employee at the airport, so he greeted me in Korean. When I submitted my ticket, he said, "Oh my gosh, why did you buy this ticket so expensive? It's not a backpacker ticket, but the most expensive economy class." I was mad. I bought this ticket from a Korean travel agency, but I didn't know it was expensive. One airport employee said I bought almost business ticket price, so I had to go comfortably. He blocked except our 2 seats. In other words, they blocked the seats so that no one could ride next to us. Anyway, the rip-off fee has already been used, and we are on the plane thanking airport staff for their consideration of comfort. And I enjoyed the last in-flight meal. The most delicious meal on the 33-day trip was the in-flight meal. Celebrating our first overseas trip, we came back home to Miss. A month later I entered a convent.